Season 10, Episode 11 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading the Thomas Sowell reader, reading some of the best essays from the great economist Thomas Sowell. This chapter, as we kind of mentioned, I think at the end of last episode, we're getting into the section on race and ethnicity. I think we ended last episode with you looking at that and looking at the chapter titles and saying, "Oh no," over and over again. But I don't think these are really that inflammatory or really got too much into to really contentious issues. Mostly, most of them were really about affirmative action and government, preferential treatment and stuff like that. So it wasn't really anything too crazy. Of course, all the articles I thought were really good and made compelling arguments, but nothing as extreme as I think we might have been expecting.
Oh, I think you misinterpreted my statement.
Mm.
I know that Thomas Sowell is not incendiary
Right.
in any way
You were
objectionable.
worried about yourself.
Yeah, I am. I am
Yes.
very worried about myself right now, because the last thing that you can do
Mhm.
in America is to talk honestly about race.
Mm.
Um, you can sometimes talk honestly about sexism.
Mhm.
You certainly can criticize men.
Yes. As you were
Um,
alluding to before we started recording, with your
off,
frustrations at the world,
not the world,
just one
only
subset
one
of the
half,
world.
only one half. Actually, it's a small subset
Yes.
of one half.
Hmm.
We'll just let everybody guess about what we're referring to. We don't need to go down that
No,
path because
no.
we're on racism
Yes.
and economics and Thomas Sowell again. It's a collection of essays on this topic, and he's really been a leader on this subject. Now he's getting up in years, and I think he published a book maybe a year or two ago. So he's still been active, although I haven't seen an interview with him in the last few months. But he's going to be in his 90s, I
Oh
think.
yeah, he's old.
But the last one I saw, I think it was last year in 2024, because he was a Hoover
Hmm.
fellow or
Yeah.
with a Hoover institution, and so there's a really good podcast series of interviews through Hoover called Uncommon Knowledge, and I don't know if are you familiar with that at all?
I've heard the name.
Peter Robinson, he's kind of he kind of gives off an air that he's aloof, but he actually is just his mannerisms, and he's very well read. He's of that. Well, I guess he's in California now, but he's of that kind of class of. He's about my age, maybe a couple years older. Not my class. He's higher class
Hmm.
than me. He
Sure.
like comes from that really highly educated, maybe uh, boarding school type.
Mm.
But I don't know that he went to a boarding school. So he gives off this air, but he's a great interviewer. And he frames questions very well, and he lets the subject run with it, and then he does follow up. So they're always great interviews. So if you're ever interested in somebody and learning more about them or what they think or they believe, and you see that he's done an interview with them, absolutely watch it. He's done great ones with he's done a series of them with Soul, and he's done a series with him, Victor Davis Hanson, I'm a big fan of, and a number of other people.
Mm.
It's fascinating. Anyway, so the first one is Older Budweiser, which
Yeah.
is not about the Budweiser beer, but about people of Czech and German ancestries in Europe,
Hmm.
in Bohemia.
Yeah. In
And
Budweis, Germany.
what?
In Budweis, Germany specifically, or Budweis.
Budweiss? It's Budweiss.
Yes, sure.
Um, by the way, I don't know if I read a headline
Hmm.
that Bud Light sales are still down like 40% from what they
I've
were
heard the same. Yeah.
immediately before the Mulvaney massacre.
Yeah. Well, I mean, living near a college campus, right? I mean, I don't think it's really recovered. I mean, you hear people talking about, favorite beer, Bud Light, or beer that they commonly drink. Bud Light is never mentioned anymore, especially around among young men. I think it's really lost its foothold in the market.
It's really wild because that
Yeah.
was like the college beer
Yeah.
back in my day and age. I mean, that was huge. And the reason why I was thinking of it, although it was a Budweiser commercial, one of the better Budweiser commercials was the three frogs on a log. And one would say, Bud.
Mm.
The second one would say, the third one would say, and the middle one would say, Wise, and then they eventually get around to saying Budweiser.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, as you see, they take it out of order to mess with you. But
Yes.
it was just a simple ad, and I guess they don't do those anymore. Anyway,
Yeah.
so he's talking about Budweiser. Is that what you're how
Budweiss.
you
Yeah. I think
Budweiser?
that's how you pronounce it. Budweiss
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
Budweiss.
you and Peter Robinson get along great. Anyway,
Thanks.
so this area, he mentions how these two communities got along very well, but the Germans tend to be the higher class or higher educated, more economically advantageous group, and so the people that were Czech in that area would study German and take on German errors anyway. So that eventually some of the Czech leadership started advocating for a separation,
Mhm.
and some of it, I like. It may sound surprising. I like ethnic pride. I
Mhm.
like, I like the like if you go like an Irish American community will have flags of Ireland
Yeah.
and USA, and I agree with like if you're a Mexican ancestry, Mexican flags with American flags, that kind of thing, and it's fun, and you should be proud of your
Yeah.
heritage. But he gives this example of how there's a separation,
Mhm.
because of advocates trying to focus on the separate identity, and the bad things flowed from those decisions, and that kind of balkanization, as you if you will, in an area near the Balkans, and how destructive it is. And then of course this he's describing how that happened before World War II, and then of course the Germans uh, were then maybe extra motivated to punish the Czechs
Mhm.
in World War II when they conquered it, and then because they had an ethnic minority in certain areas that were German rather than Czech, and then of course after World War II, then the opposite would happen. It's just so destructive to treat people exclusively as members of groups, not just
Yeah.
like, hey, you're proud of your heritage, but to so it was kind of his introduction to this entire structure, and it has the benefit of describing societal pressures and mistakes in a country that has nothing to do with race,
Yeah.
like skin color, because I mean maybe there's some, I don't know, but maybe there's some physical attributes that are different between Czechs and Germans, but I don't suppose there's a lot. Like,
Mhm.
can you tell the difference between a Czech and a German?
I mean, probably not. I wouldn't say so. But I thought it was interesting, how he mentions in here, like a lot of it's like cultural stuff that was sort of
Yes.
imposed by the government. Like all the street signs have to be changed to Czech. There has to be a certain percentage of Czech music and stuff like that. And it's things like that that really, I think, tip things
Yes.
in these sorts of quotas. Like all of a sudden, it's like not just, you have to have access, to this sorts of education for these people. It's no, we're mandating that this stuff be in this particular language or in this particular culture group to like make up for it. You
Yes.
see stuff like that, all throughout history, and it's never really a good thing when it's mandated that no, this is the only language that we speak here, or along those lines. When it's specifically trying to get back at like a higher power. Now, I was just reading an article. I was just actually presenting an article in class yesterday about how that happened in North Africa. This article I had a few problems with, but the main point is correct in that throughout North Africa, the government was like, no, we're Arab. We speak Arabic, even though standard Arabic, classical standard Arabic, or classical Arabic or modern standard Arabic wasn't really spoken in North Africa until the 1950s. Before that, it was
Mm.
Berber, and then there was a local sort of North African Arabic dialect. But then there was this big movement, like North Africa's part of the Arab sort of continuum, where we're Islamic, things like that. And all of a sudden, it's okay. No, we're making Arabic the only language. You have to unite around this language, just completely ignoring 2,000 years of history
Yeah.
and things like that. It's fascinating to see how that stuff happens all over the place, and it's usually very, if it's done in sort of a vindictive manner like that, it's really terrible.
Yeah, because if it happens naturally, of course it happens, then it'll happen gradually
Hmm.
over time, and in some ways that especially somebody like you that's a linguist would be saddened by a language you know going to nothing, nobody's speaking it anymore. But if you leave everything alone, um, and everybody's getting along, eventually you're going to have bilingual, and then at some point, depending on how things shake out, you might end up just having a dominant language, and
Hmm.
then it's a less popular language.
Yeah.
And it just seems so destructive when they try to force that
Hmm.
quotas and that kind of thing. Like in this Czech and German example, the Budweiser example, they were even mandating the number of songs that the municipal band would play at
Yeah.
festivals. It's like, okay, well, it's one thing to say, hey, why don't you throw a couple songs in there for that are Czech. That's that'd be fine, but do you have to have a percentage? Are we going to do this by percentage of population? And then and then you see the same things in America that are contemporary. Like
Hmm.
um, I don't even know the history, and I think I need to look it up or something. But that black national anthem that they play before the Super Bowl, or African American national anthem, or whatever that is, it's really a boring tune, by the way. Um, I would expect something more peppy.
Mm.
Uh, is that bad to say?
I
it
don't think so.
was very very bland.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder who wrote it.
I have no idea.
I bet you it's a boring white guy.
It could very well could be.
Because
That's funny.
it's not memorable. I
Yeah.
cannot even remember the tune. I
Yeah.
mean, they play it before big sporting events now,
Yeah.
and I think and that's all well and good, but I think it's trying to separate people. But I was happy with like as far as I know, nobody knelt during the national anthem, which is nice. It's kind of a different rendition,
Hmm.
which I was a big fan of, but it was, kind of like a Cajun version or whatever. Um, but it seems like we're kind of reunifying a little bit at a
Yeah.
time, which I think is encouraging. And we can, it'd be good to celebrate our differences where we're not at each other's throats.
Yeah.
Speaking of at each other's throats, what
Yeah.
about diversity in India,
Yeah,
which is
this
the
next
next
one
one?
was interesting. I mean, his main point throughout this one is I don't know when this was written because I certainly
Mhm.
didn't, don't see this as a thing anymore. But he says, a lot of Americans have this idea of India as this sort of peaceful, sort of pacifist country in some way, and they just live, in complete harmony with one another. And it's really just him going through these examples of just really horrible violence from the Muslim population against the Hindu population and vice versa. And
Yes.
so it's like, yeah, it's we kind of have this weird sort of painted image in America of India being this very peaceful place where everybody, gets together and gets along. But in reality, it's when you have such different cultures sort of pitted against each other always, it's just going to be a terrible end circumstance for everybody involved.
Yeah, this is one of the few examples, and maybe it's the only one I've seen yet that seems untimely
Yeah.
because it was at the time. It was kind of a weird, like, oh, Hindus are peaceful, kind of like um, I think this is after the era where like
Yeah, I
the
know you had it like,
Beatles
yeah, in the 60s, there's a big
went to
interest in
some
Eastern music. Yeah.
spiritualist. Yeah, so I think this is going to be written long after that, but there was still kind of a holdover of that general peace, love, and happiness spiritualism from India. But it for anybody that knows anything about, and I'm not an expert on India, but knew that the partition was horrific,
Hmm.
India and Pakistan, and I think it's commonly known now that you generally don't want to travel there alone as a woman,
Hmm.
a Western woman, because you run into some problems.
Yeah.
Um, but I think his point is, um, that uh, these kind of different warring factions are dangerous,
Yeah.
and and just because you might think that they're a peaceful, pleasant people doesn't necessarily make it so.
Yeah. And his point
And
also is, we can't single it out as being, a paradise or, a real
sure,
pacifist, peaceful country, but we also can't single out for being unique in this regard.
yes,
He points to Sri Lanka and, Rwanda and the Balkans and all these other cases when you just have very similar circumstances when, yeah, it's very diverse. You have very different people living in this country, but the problem is if they don't have sort of a common unity among them, and if they're just constantly fighting with each other, it's
yes,
it's not going to be a good place to live in the slightest. It's going to produce some real horrors within the country.
yeah. I did like this quote. It's towards the end of it. where he says, today, however, our citizen of the world types are doing all they can to keep foreigners foreign and domestic minorities riled up over grievances, past and present, real and imaginary. Above all, they want group identity and group preferences and quotas. And he's warning against that. And that's, of course, what we've had for the last 4 years on steroids, going off the deep end on that. And hopefully we'll see an end to that soon in the struggle of the current federal administration.
Hopefully, we'll see. What'd you think of this next article titled "The Slavery Card"?
The slavery, the get out of any responsibility card that the people are still waiting around, and I am still so surprised that anyone is getting any sort of. I view these people, anybody's getting any sort of positive press advocating about slavery reparations or whatever about slavery today. I view these people like flat earthers. It's like, why do I'm not calling for censorship, but you're generally not going to put somebody on a national commentary show to talk about how the earth is flat, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say they can't hold those views or espouse them in their own manner, but I think the same thing is true about reparations people, because there's so world history of how we all of us have in our ancestry, no matter where we came from, have people that we've come from that either owned, well, let's put it, we've all had ancestors who have owned slaves. We've all had ancestors that were slaves at one time or another, if you go back far enough, because it was ubiquitous. And it wasn't round. I mean, I think the racial aspect of slavery in America was relatively unique. Because the Europeans slaved other Europeans. Slave comes from Slav, famously, but different tribes and different communities would just sell people off to slavery. They were interchangeable, and the race was not the predominant factor until very recently. And then, of course, it's the Western governments, the United States, and primarily Great Britain, the British, great English and British Empire, that put an end to it.
Yeah.
And after all those hundreds, if not thousands of years of widespread slavery, it was ended mainly by the British.
Yeah. And then that's kind of what he mentions throughout here. I mean, he
Yes.
says slavery was not about race. And the point that he makes is like what you're saying throughout all of history. Any group everywhere has been enslaved. He says really that the reason it was the African population is just because that was the available population at the time. That's just who it was. Yes. And then I think you're right about what he says. Says what was peculiar about the American situation was not just that slaves and slave owners were of different races, but that slavery contradicted the whole philosophy of freedom on which the society was founded. If all men were created equal, as the Declaration of Independence said, then blacks had to be depicted as less than men. He says, and that's where you get this real, racial element that sort of persists even after slavery. Is that you have to come up with a bunch of reasons for why this is okay. And so it wasn't that slavery, was dependent on those reasons. Those reasons came about because slavery existed. And so you have all these people writing sort of apologetics for the system and for why, these people should be treated in a different way. And that just persists. I think that's the argument he's trying to make.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But however, there was a lot of racism.
Yes,
real racism. Yeah. The eugenics theory that they really were espousing that people of African descent were not were different in fundamental ways.
Yeah,
and there's a long history that I don't know that it was not all just to justify slavery. But I think it's certain those same arguments were all used to justify slavery, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
make a distinction there. But.
Yeah. This next article was good too, just titled in quotes "minorities,"
Yes.
And he opens up telling the story. He says he's running a research project in Washington. And there's some grant to hire minority professionals. He says, "Oh, that's great. I have a Jewish friend from Princeton who I'd love to bring down and help me on this project." And of course, he gets told, "Well, the Jews don't count as minorities. Yeah. That's ridiculous. They only make up 3% of the population. How much of a minority could you be?" He makes the point throughout here about how Asian Americans, and this seems like it was really before this was more widespread throughout higher education. Because I was reading this, I'm like, yeah, this is common knowledge now. but he
Mhm.
seems to talk about it. He mentions the U.S. Air Force Academy gave lower cutoff scores for quote minority applicants being recruited, but Asian Americans had to meet the same standards as it was whites, and he says, few institutions are so impolitic to put such policies forward so openly. I'm like, maybe they were back when he was writing this, but then it just
Yeah.
became such a big thing. Then it moved into a lot of higher ed, especially the Ivy Leagues, where it's Asian Americans are suddenly white. It's like
Mhm.
that's how does that work? But it's all based on what he says is you just want people that you can feel bad for, and that's what
Yeah.
really qualifies people. Just somebody that you can say, oh, that's a really underprivileged group. Look at how sad they are, and I can make myself feel better by admitting them in higher numbers.
Yeah. These are people who you feel sorry for.
Yeah.
That you have some pity for them because of the unfortunate nature of their birth. It's so condescending. It's so insulting.
Hmm.
And I love those man in the street videos where they ask a bunch of white people on campus, and they're always white. Why do you think the voter ID laws are racist? And they oh, we can't get an ID. And then I love the guys that go into the hood and they're like, hey, you got ID? Yeah, I got ID. How'd you figure out how to get ID? What do you mean, how did I figure out how to get ID? Everybody has an ID. What do you it's just so, it's just,
Yeah.
I think the thing that bothers me about so much of this stuff is what I'll mention COVID. I haven't
Oh
mentioned
boy.
many episodes. Is what drove me insane about COVID was it was just so illogical.
Yeah.
It's like the slavery reparations argument is so illogical. Nobody living presently has a grandparent
Yeah.
that was a slave. And they make these half-assed arguments about, well, it carries on forward. Oh my gosh. Well, that's when you get into, okay, we've all been, children of slaves. So how far back are we going and what percentages?
Yeah.
And who was it? I think it was Oprah that it was on a show. That one guy, I think he's on PBS, where he does, genealogy
Mm-hmm.
and pulls up pictures and records and that kind of stuff. And I think it might have been Oprah, somebody pretty prominent
Yeah.
that had an ancestor that was both a slave and a slave owner. I mean,
Yeah.
different ancestors, but in the same era,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, I don't know what to think about that. Yeah, welcome to the club.
Yeah.
Like you're part of the club.
Yeah.
Everybody else, you're not some benighted victim,
Yeah.
innocent and pure, and all that stuff.
Yeah. I really also like the point he makes in this one about how you're really doing a disservice to these groups. If you lower the
Oh,
standards
100%.
for these people to get in, it's like these are groups of people who would have, he says they would have made the dean's list at other colleges. But a lot of the times, if you're lowering the standards, he points out MIT as his example. If they can't meet those standards, and all of a sudden they're way low, they might drop out. He says, I think it was a quarter of black students fail to finish their program at MIT. They
Yeah.
drop out before the end, and so it's like, well, they would have excelled literally anywhere else, but
Yes.
because you've lowered the standards for them to get in, and then they can't keep up. And now we might have a different problem where even not just admittance standards, but I think just class standards overall have been decreasing. And I think
Yes.
that's because of these statistics he's citing. It's like, well, ooh,
Yeah.
we can't have this many people dropping out from these groups. We have to just lower standards across the board, which has just led to an even bigger problem.
That's an excellent point. Mainly because I was about to make it.
That's good.
Because it's true, and I've talked about it in my low level class. It's like the standards are so low, and there's zero incentive for a teacher or an instructor to have high standards. I mean,
Yeah.
there's zero incentive. And now you say, well, maybe if you had the character and the the good sense to have high standards, it's its own reward.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, tell that to somebody who has a complaint filed against him for flunking some dummy. It's like, but that has not happened to me yet.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good.
It will sooner or later.
Oh boy.
Sometimes my blunt style is not appreciated.
That's
It's somebody.
surprising. I can't imagine why.
I had somebody insult me today.
Oh, really?
Because in response to an email, a long email asking for a special accommodation. Here, you want me to tell the story?
Sure, go for it.
I don't have to. I don't
No,
have
no,
to.
no, no, no. Go for it.
Um, it was a person asking for a special accommodation on a traffic ticket, and my response was, "Sorry, no." I
Hmm.
don't think it needed any explanation, and I generally don't explain stuff on a traffic. I'm a municipal prosecutor in a couple of jurisdictions, and so the response was, "Oh, my client, get this, my client is not a citizen,
Hmm.
is applying for citizenship, and so this, I want this different, better disposition for this non-citizen,
Mm-hmm.
because it may or may not affect the citizenship application. So that my response was, um, I have no intention of treating a foreign citizen better than an American citizen. I will treat
Mm-hmm.
them the same.
Yes.
But if you want me to take into account the citizenship status of the defendant, then I will treat them worse, because I'm going to treat an American citizen. If I'm going to treat them differently, I'm going to treat an American citizen better,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's logical.
Uh-huh.
That person was incensed.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go down the whole story because it made a number of twists and turns
Mm.
after that, including, probably not going to do it. I've always found a way to work out issues with opposing counsel so that I've never had to file a bar complaint
Mm-hmm.
about anybody. But this person came real close.
Wow.
It was in real trouble with her response to that email.
Interesting. Very
Yeah, so
interesting.
I can tell you offline about
Yeah,
it.
sure.
That's a teaser for our listeners. If they want to ask me in person, I might tell the rest of that story. But it's uh, people don't want to be told those things,
Mm-hmm.
and so I fear that at some point in my the end of my academic career will most likely end in a flurry of strongly worded missives,
Oh, good. That's.
back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my prediction. Because at some point, I'm just going to say no.
Yeah.
Nope, I'm not going to play the game anymore. And I'm not really playing a game. I'm trying to do my best within this system, but it's like, um, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard. I think it's hard for these students who are coming out of these public schools that haven't been taught a lot of stuff
Yeah.
that they
For
need to
sure.
know before they hit my door.
For sure.
And so then it's like, oh man, I got to help them through this. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry to go down that tangent.
No, it's all right. Yeah. This
And it's
next.
100% not race related.
Yeah. Yeah, this next article I thought was really good. It's called Race, Romance, and Reality. And he starts
Yes.
off with telling the story about his brother back in the 1960s. He says, during one of the ghetto riots of the 1960s, my brother was out in the streets asking the rioters, "Where are you going to shop after you burn down this man's store?"
Yes.
He's like, thankfully, he was not harmed for asking that question. He says his next sentence is, although a riot is not the best place for Socratic dialogue, my brother somehow returned home safely, which I got a kick out of that. But he's making a good point. Is that in these sort of revolutions is what they're often framed as. People taking back their power. They're hurting their own communities.
Oh
They're
man.
burning down stores. And he says, now in Harlem, you have to drive much farther to get to a grocery store and to get to the food that you need, and it costs you more because you have to go farther. You have to get pay for gas or transportation and things like that. He says this is him talking. When he was growing up in the 40s and the 50s or the 60s, he's like, yeah, there's one on the corner and then there's one across the street and there's a supermarket just down the road and you can get everything within a block.
Yep.
But now, because you've had all of these problems, you have people literally destroying their own communities. Nobody else wants to open up a shop there, or they go out of business because they have to pay for damages and theft and things like that. And it's like you're if, in trying to rectify things in this sort of noble spirit as it's often portrayed, you're really just hurting yourselves.
Well, and that's why the stores have to charge more
Hmm.
in certain communities because the theft rate is so high.
Yeah.
That's why there's so many Walgreens and CVS's and chain pharmacies that are closing in certain areas because the stealing rate is so
Yeah.
high.
Well, I've noticed that there's a lot of 24/7 CVS's here in Gainesville, and Gainesville's not a bad city. I mean, there's certain parts that are a little bit worse, but every single thing just about is locked up, and it
Yep.
feels like I'm paying $10 more for everything than I would be if I went to Walmart. And even at Walmart, they're starting to lock up everything. Even since I've been down here, they've been locking up more
Yeah.
stuff. And it's
Yeah.
crazy. It's like it's just making everything so much more difficult and so much worse.
Yeah. Our culture has become very permissive of stealing,
Yeah.
and it's and I'm shocked that the self checkout lanes are still open even
Hmm.
locally. But I think they're having such a hard time hiring people
Yeah.
that they're caught where they're having a hard time making the transition back. but the amount of skip scanning, which is what it's called, where you scan one thing but put three
Yeah.
things into the bag, and stealing in that manner is just off the charts. And in our area, it's all, it's what, 90 something percent Caucasian, and so this is not a racial thing, but it's a cultural thing, because every one of the defendants I prosecute for stealing in the municipal court, they're all white,
Yeah.
and it used to be most of the shoplifters were like middle-aged women. It's a thing, um, and they would do it for like an emotional fix or whatever. Or there were less professionals, and now it's just garden variety. Everybody's stealing something. I mean, it's crazy. They have to
Hmm.
lock things up, and it's so frustrating. You go, like, I like those cheap earbuds,
Hmm.
at Walmart, and then I lose them or whatever, and they're like $15,
Yeah.
and they're locked up. And then I'm like, okay, and sometimes they'll let me, just walk away and check out later. A lot of times I have to buy them back there. I'm like, it's
Yeah.
$15,
Yeah.
but whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, they got to do what they got to do, but
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I thought that was a
it,
really.
it, it it's certainly in an inner city, in those predominantly African American communities, because of the costs associated with those kind of issues. The prices are so much higher. It's
Hmm.
harder to live.
Yeah.
They talk about food deserts, but they misdiagnose the problem.
Hmm.
It's because who in their right mind would have like an open air farmers market? Like, I don't know if you've seen those videos where a guy who spends most of his time in an inner city goes out to like the suburbs,
Hmm.
and he goes to a gas station. He's like, there's a pallet of water out here, water bottles, and they're just out there. Like, there's motor oil and windshield wiper fluid out here. If this were back home, it'd be gone.
Yeah.
And you just walk in the store. You go into some neighborhoods, and you have to put them like you're at a bank,
Hmm.
where you have to put the money in that metal tray,
Yeah.
and they won't even interact with you in any way. Some of you can't even get inside the store. But if you do, the 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 employee is behind bulletproof glass, and that's expensive,
Yeah.
and it drives up the cost for everything, and it's just sad.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, this next article was interesting too. He's the dog in the manger politics is what he calls it. And he tells the
Have you
story
ever heard
about.
that expression before?
I haven't. No, I'd
Yeah,
never
yeah,
heard it. Yeah.
yeah.
But he says, this plastic surgeon of Chinese ancestry used to work in Malaysia, but then there's a big uprising essentially, and so we need to get all the Chinese people out of the country and replace them with Malaysians. And he says, well, and the Chinese guy was like, okay, I understand. I'll vacate my spot to a Malaysian person, but just let me keep performing these surgeries for people with disfigurements and stuff like that until you find somebody. And so even this guy who was really understanding, they're like, no, they booted him out immediately,
Yeah.
and he moved to Australia. And so then no doctor really took his place, and so it was the Malaysian people were now the ones who were suffering from that.
Yes.
And so it's in these efforts to sort of solve these problems and make things better for local people or things like that. You're really just making the problem worse. Kind of similar to the last article when you're kind of destroying your own community. It's just going to make things worse for you.
Yes.
And he applies that, he talks about Nigeria as well. You had similar stuff like that. And it's really just about targeting the rich. It's whatever policy we can make that would make the rich worse off, if we're sort of the ruling class in the society, then it's just automatically better. And what, a lot of these people don't realize or don't want to admit is that just often makes your own people worse off because you've lost a lot of those high skilled professions like this plastic surgeon in Malaysia.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of his articles in this series are just about demagoguery and just
Yeah.
defaming groups of people, and also cutting off your nose to spite your face, as the saying
Hmm.
goes. And he's talking about how, as he says on page 255, what is involved is not just envy, it is a threat to one's ego that is crucial in promoting dog in the manger policies that he's describing. So because to concede that, like, a certain group of people that have a different set of cultural values, such as hard work and valuing education, and uh, um, being married before you have kids, and
Hmm.
staying married after you have kids, all those are signs of success.
Yeah.
And instead of looking inward and saying, well, why isn't our community doing this, and what can we do to fix that? It's like, well, those people are just bad,
Hmm.
because they're taking from us. They're only successful because they're taking from us what we should already have, and it's because it's a threat to their ego that maybe we're not doing it right.
Hmm. Yeah.
And he's 100% right on that.
Yeah. The next article I thought was very similar to what we already had earlier, so we probably don't have to talk about it too much. It's
Sure.
called, in quotes, Friends of Blacks. And it's really just about academia again, especially medical school, he's pointing out, where if we're lowering the standards. I mean, it's really the same point he was making earlier. But this affirmative grading is what it was called in a lot of these universities. You know, we have to kind of lower the standards here to allow more people to graduate. And I really like this quote that he has. He says, "A professor at one of California's state universities where black students are allowed to graduate on the basis of easier standards, put it bluntly, says, we are just lying to these black students when we give them degrees.
Yeah.
That lie is particularly deadly when the degree is a medical degree, authorizing someone to treat sick people or perform surgery on children. And this is really just pointing out, sort of the end causes of a lot of these problems. Just not just that some people will drop out if the standards are too high, or if they're admitted, and maybe they shouldn't have been. But no, these are actual physical things that are going to have impact on communities, and it's going to lead to a lot of issues, as I think we've seen since he's written this, whenever it
Oh
was
yeah.
20 years ago or so.
Yeah. I mean, even like that recent example of that tragic helicopter hitting the plane in Washington D.C. Once of course they slow rolled announcing that the helicopter pilot was a female for whatever reason, but once you hear that, if you've been paying attention to the concerted effort in the military and also the airlines to purposely exclude white men, meaning to have quotas to hire more people that are not white men, which means
Hmm.
necessarily exclude them to the benefit. Then the implication is that the other people, the women or whoever else who's not white men, wouldn't have gotten those positions unless there's merit. So you automatically wonder, I wonder if that was just a mistake that anybody could have made, or if it's because of incompetence, because that person should have been put that place, didn't earn the spot.
Yeah.
And it's horrible for us to have to wonder that.
Yeah.
And if we just had the same standards applied to everybody, we wouldn't be wondering that. You
Hmm.
know, and it's so destructive for those
Yeah.
successful people of the groups that you're trying to be friendly with, as he
Yeah.
says, be their friends and help them. You're destroying them.
Yeah. It's
You're destroying their
especially
reputations.
Yeah, it's especially crazy just to kind of think of, maybe how little actual support there was for so many of these initiatives. Because
Yes.
as we're seeing with all the USAID stuff, how much of these grants and federal money that was being used just going straight to these, sort of left wing activist organizations, how much of that's just sort of being recycled back into this thing. It's like, how many people actually supported this? Are all of these ideas just sort of propped up by the federal government at this point? All these organizations pushing for these terrible policies and sort of
Yep.
marketing them towards the people like, no, this is a real grassroots movement. And well, half your money's coming from the federal government. Is it really? It's just sort
Right.
of this endless cycle of lowering standards
Yeah.
and making issues worse.
Which bleeds into the next
Yes.
article, which is giving business the business, where he's way ahead of the curve on the
Hmm.
diversity uh, uh, racket
Yeah,
in
consultants.
businesses, the
Yeah, that's what he
diversity
calls them.
consultants, which are paid to do who knows what to make it be disruptive to a business cohesiveness. He mentions that effrontery and gall are pretty much the essentials for these diversity consultants,
Yeah.
and is really just going after them as a waste of money. But he's way ahead of the curve on those, and that
Hmm.
that that is so much of what it reminds me of the Soviet Union commissars that were so disruptive to the Soviet leadership at the beginning of World War II. That before and well, like part of the reason why Russia struggled so much with their war with Finland is because they had political appointees that said we cannot retreat.
Yeah.
And so sometimes a tactical retreat is the best option to regather your forces and maybe hit somebody from an angle or from the side or their flank, flank them. But they were under political orders; they are not to retreat, and so they just either stood their ground or attacked when they had to retreat. And there's so many thousands of troops were killed for that reason, and it just bogs down any sort of positive development within any organization, especially the government. And these diversity hires and diversity managers in education and in the government
Hmm.
are doing just that. And
Yeah.
it's just such a drain on
Yeah.
productivity. It's amazing.
I mean, hopefully we're starting to see the end of some of this. I know a lot of companies have already eliminated those sorts of departments. A lot of schools have. We'll see if it sticks. But this article I thought was one of the funniest he's had in here.
Yeah.
I really like that this passage. It says, what are their skills? What are their credentials? What benefits can they promise? Their skills are considerable. They have been known to reduce some employees to tears with their badgering, sneers, and insinuations, just as they've been known to reduce some college students to tears when they take their act onto the campus. They are great at laying on guilt trips or getting personal in a nasty way. Often they treat adults like children or like guinea pigs. He's like, yeah,
Yeah.
they're really good at their jobs. They have great skills. It's just it's unfortunate that they are entirely useless and divisive and actually a burden on companies.
Yes.
But yeah, no, this one was really good.
I think the last one we're going to go is the next one,
Yes, yeah, that's
stereotypes
right.
versus the market. I have a little bit of a bone to pick with what his conclusion of this, only in the sense that he's discussing how the market can correct for racist people.
Hmm.
Because he gives an example like if you're a racist owner of a professional basketball team, and you hate black people, I guess, you're necessarily going to limit the people that are going to be able to play at the highest level because you're excluding people because of your racist philosophy. And I agree with that, but you have to have a legal structure
Hmm.
that that would allow other owners to not be racist.
Yeah.
It's like so like when you had all white baseball leagues, you could still be a profitable baseball team owner if you were racist and wouldn't allow African Americans or anybody else to compete. So I think the entire article presumes a legal structure that is not discriminatory.
Hmm.
But other than that, I think he makes excellent points about how um, even if some people are racist and are arbitrary about some things, the market's going to correct it because um, others will see the value in the people or the product or whatever.
Yeah.
And
No, no,
maybe some. Go ahead.
I was just I agree. I think if I have one sort of problem with Soul throughout this book, and I don't really have a big problem, but I do think he relies a little bit too much on like the free market will just naturally fix things. I don't
Yeah.
think that's necessarily true. I'm not a big like free market above all else type person. I don't think it's going to solve every single problem. You do have to have, like you said, those legal protections and also just societal frameworks in
Yeah.
place to do things that the free market won't. If everybody's just sort of driven by self-interest, there's a lot of things that won't be accomplished in a society. And you need things like religion and a strong moral culture and stuff like that the free market won't just produce on its own. But no, I do think he's right in his conclusion in a way. Like if you do provide for those other sorts of institutions, then yeah, it's just not profitable for the free market to be sort of evil in that way, like some people think it is.
Yeah. And I think to somebody of his generation, those cultural forces were so invisible
Yeah.
because they're ubiquitous.
Hmm.
And so when you see, where he talks about like Harlem when he was growing up had had stores and relatively low crime and all that. Well, that was, and I would expect that the churches were all full too,
Hmm.
and I know that they would have a much higher percentage of intact two parent households,
Yeah.
and so how much that can't be solved with economics.
Yeah.
You can encourage marriage, but you have to encourage those values somehow in the tax code that would make a difference. And I don't know that a
Yeah.
tax code or a free market is gonna fix those
Yeah.
things.
Because I think the right does deserve at least a good portion of the blame for the situation we're in now. Not as much as the left. I think the left is much more aggressive at trying to collapse a lot of these institutions and make people move away from them. But for such a long period, especially through the 80s, 90s, really into the 2000s, the
Yes.
right's approach to everything was just passive. Let everybody do whatever they want. We really shouldn't use any power here. We shouldn't really, enforce anything, promote anything. 'Cause that's not what government should do. That's not what, society should do. Just everybody do whatever you want. Sort of liberties is the ultimate principle. Be free to do what you please. But if you kind of run like that when your opponents are just so aggressively sort of dismantling things, then the sort of hands-off approach is going to lead to a lot of the problems.
Yeah, I guess what I would say, I agree with that. But in defense of the right, there was
Hmm.
a strong portion of the right that was pushing
Hmm.
those social
Yeah.
considerations and were not free market libertarians. but when a push came to shove, um, they got shoved out of the way because they're
Yeah.
like, well, vote for the candidate against those evil Democrats,
Mhm.
after the primary, and they never had any money, and so the big money, libertarian, low tax, um, side of the Republican Party was dominant for so long.
Yeah.
And it was only until Trump that really the other side got a lot of footing. And I don't give Trump, maybe I should give him more credit, but I don't give him really any credit for the philosophical change of the
Hmm.
party. Like I don't know, he seems like he's more instinctive, but he allowed people like, well, like what's his name? Oh, he spoke at your campus.
Josh
Uh,
Hammer.
Josh Hammer. With common good conservatism, constitutional arguments, and Josh Hawley,
Hmm.
who has the same kind of pro family, populist, um, intellectual philosophy
Yeah.
that really buttresses Trump's populism.
Yeah, and
Trump has
JD
this kind of
Vance especially now. I
JD
mean,
Vance,
he wasn't
oh,
around. Trump
huge,
won, but
yeah,
now we have the Vice President of the United States, tweeting out about Catholic philosophy using the Latin terms.
yes,
It's like we've come so far. We're so different now. Where it's like no, the right is now appealing to sort of higher principles and virtue and things like that. Where it's not just everybody do whatever you want and we'll sort of leave you alone.
yeah,
It's more of no, there is some sort of common good that we should be pursuing. That's actually the purpose of government is to secure the
yeah.
common good. So yeah, the philosophical I think tradition is really coming in force now. That's been sort of dormant for the past few decades, but has always existed.
And did you read? You have JD Vance's biography,
I
right?
have, I have, I don't, I haven't read it yet. It's sitting on my shelf.
I just read it, and actually, your mom read it like in a week after I did. I said, I think you should, because she was done with her book, and she's a voracious reader too. So she just finished it. It's really good, and you can see he wrote it, after his marriage, but before his political career began.
Hmm.
Where he's just finished law school basically, and he goes through his history, and he talks. He kind of talks about social science a little bit too. So it's a different kind of biography, but you can see that his current philosophy carries through from the time that he wrote that book. It's very consistent, and it is a lot different than, um, my generation's
Yeah,
original Republican philosophy,
yeah.
of the 80s and 90s, as you said. It's
Hmm.
significantly different. It's still consistent with it, but very much like there is a call for some government activism
Yeah,
in support of families and support of the society, which was not advocated by
yeah.
Republicans in the
It's
80s,
it's
90s, and
definitely got more
2000.
of a firmer foundation. I think it's much more
Yeah,
well, it's much more conservative for sure. It's
yeah,
looking back at the best ideas, is what the Conservative Party should have been. I mean, Ordo Amoris goes back to Saint Augustine in the
right.
fifth century, so it's like
Yeah.
yeah, we're going way far back to talk about our political principles here, which I think is fantastic and
What
is
did you notice
what we need to
that,
do.
that Trump, during at the prayer, he had a couple prayer breakfast speeches, but one of them he mentioned after he got shot that he became more religious,
Hmm.
which is different than saying more, um, spiritual, or a stronger belief in God. He actually said he was more religious
Hmm.
and believed in religion more. And I'm still of the opinion. I mean, I don't know if I made this prediction on this
I
podcast,
think
but
you
I
might
think
have.
he will be Catholic by the end of 2025.
Hopefully, we can hope.
Um, but the problem is that stupid, Pope, appointed a left wing bishop for the archdiocese in Washington
Hmm.
D.C. Came literally straight out of San Francisco.
Yeah, it's
So, but I think there's a good, isn't what's his face still in New York?
um.
Been
Oh,
there
I don't know.
forever.
I'm not
Um,
sure. I'm not sure what his name is.
yeah. So, but Trump is just, I don't know if he hasn't really pardoned the mayor, but he had the case dismissed.
Yeah, Eric Adams.
So
Yeah.
he's rebuilding the Empire State.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts for this episode?
A lot of thoughts.
I
None
know
of
you
them are
do.
final. All of them are tentative.
That's good. That's good. All right. Well, I don't have any more thoughts.
You don't have
Great.
any more final thoughts or tentative thoughts?
None that I can think of. I mean, great chapter or great section as always. Really well argued. But yeah, looking forward to the next few. I think we'll have two more
Yes.
episodes that we'll do with this section of the book, because there's a couple chapters or a couple articles that are much longer than most of the
Yeah.
articles we've had towards the end of this section. So this will probably be in the third episode on race and ethnicity here. But yeah, I've been Adam Bishop,
I'm still Mark Bishop.
and this has been season 10, episode 11 of Unlimited Opinions. Good night.